False Claims of Colonial Thieves by Charmaine Papertalk Green and John Kinsella isn't your standard VCE text. It's not a novel, it's a collaborative poetry collection. Two voices in conversation, Indigenous and Non-Indigenous, looking at Australia's past, present and future. Because of that, you can't analyse it the same way you would Oedipus or Much Ado About Nothing. It's part history, part poetry, part dialogue, and its focus on Indigenous history makes it one of the most relevant texts on the list today. In this video, I'm going to give you the 5 essential elements to include in your next essay on false claims of colonial thieves, the exact things that will help you stand out and show your teacher you're aiming for that A+. The first thing that we need to consider is the fact that this text is a dynamic text. This poetry collection is a collaboration, not one author, but two. It's as simple as that, yet so many people fail to recognize this. As a result of this, you need to make sure your analysis considers both JK's and CPG's views equally. A lot of people decide to overly focus on CPG and neglect JK, and the other way around. Remember, the views have been presented in a back and forth discussion where each poet lets the other speak as they listen to and observe each other's perspectives, not letting one voice override the other, a respectful conversation to put it concisely. In the same way, we as VCE English students, from an analytical standpoint, must analyze this sustained conversation in the most balanced way possible, considering the demands and wishes of both the authors equally. Here is an example of where the dynamic nature of this text is considered, and really shows the conversation that occurs between both authors. This example addresses the conversation that is occurring between both poets as they agree and refute certain things. Hence, a tip to make sure the conversational aspect of the poems is addressed between both the authors is to use verbs like JK and CPG responds to, affirms, resonates, denies, shut down, laments, and so on. This poetry collection is not fiction. It's a book surrounding real-life events from the past, present, that will ultimately have an impact on our future. Hence, we must recognize the root of its discussion, or in other words, its context. Terra nullius, the stolen generations, missionaries, assimilation policies are all examples of contextual points of discussion in this collection. Essentially, both poets examine the context of Australia's past and really try to unveil the lies hidden within the falsehoods perpetuated in a hegemonic narrative and bring the truth to light. Due to this context shapes the views, and it's extremely crucial to address this. A common problem students run into is attempting to answer the prompt question with only quotes and explanation, without connecting it to the bigger ideas of the text. Remember, you need to show the teacher or examiner who is marking your text that you have an exceptional understanding of the views and values that make up your text, and that is demonstrated through this understanding of Australian history. If you struggle with this, research more about Australia's colonial history a bit more and try look into policies like assimilation and see how JK and CPG talk about this in the discussion. Do they agree with most stuff, disagree, or even hold no opinion? Let's take a look at this context in action to understand it a little bit more. You can really see in this example, the big ideas here are assimilation, Indigenous identity and culture, and the deprivation of rights. As I'm highlighting right over here, the wishes of a domineering society, to prevent Indigenous identity and culture perceived during colonization, and talking about the compliance to restricted demands of a government through forced assimilation. These things all talk about the context very well and are fundamental to a really good understanding of the text within your text response. So never forget the importance of context. The next thing is understanding that this collection, False Claims of Colonial Thieves, is ultimately just a story of an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous author. It's important to consider their culture and their backgrounds when approaching this text. The fact that JK and CPG are from two completely different backgrounds with a quite combative history is what makes it so special. One poet has experienced one side of life, whereas the other has been placed among the other side of history. Because of this, it is important to consider that they both have a limited scope of each other. On JK's behalf, he is non-Indigenous, so it is only sensible to understand that he does not know everything about Indigenous history and culture and the way it has progressed. And even if he does, it is impossible he comprehends it to the extent that CPG does, as her experience is first-hand, whereas JK is merely an observer. As a result, he can only sympathise with the grief of the past, the history tormenting Indigenous Australians within contemporary society, but will never be able to truly experience the landscape of emotions felt by those who are personally connected to each and every event that they bring about in the text. For instance, at times all JK can do is appreciate the richness of Indigenous culture decorated by CPG in some of the poems, and comment on it briefly. He agrees with CPG, but he is not the primary storyteller in this context. Please take note of this. So as writers analysing this text, we must recognise that at times in the discussion, CPG holds the power in conveying the true extent of a storyline. Her voice is unique, and she takes upon the power of the storyteller. In the same way, JK shares instances like this, where he has a power in conveying the colonial narrative from a settler standpoint, an onlooker observing minds being built and the ignorance of it all. For example, within the poem Grandmothers. The beauty of this is that the authors combine both their unique perspectives to fill each other in on what they felt during the times of the past and present, and it can be used to frame together a story for the reader to understand themselves. It allows the readers to weigh up both perspectives and examine the faults or shortcomings we as a society face. It causes them to think, who's at fault for these shortcomings? Do I have an accountability for this division? Is it possible for both these stories to unite in solidarity, or will they always be presented in an eerie distance, just like the proposal of conversation in today's society about Indigenous land and culture? Another thing you can't miss is audience. This collection isn't just written for one group of people, it's speaking to a whole range of Australians. And in your essay, you need to show you've thought about who's being targeted and how. Here are a few examples of different audiences that are being discussed and targeted within False Claims of Colonial Thieves. Obviously, you have the Indigenous Australians, non-Indigenous Australians who are being talked to throughout the collection, but, you can be more specific. Talk about who Kinsella and CPG are talking to directly. For instance, the proponents of the mainstream Australian identity, or even, talking to open-minded members of society. The key here is to be as specific as possible when talking about the impact of the poetry to the specific audience group. Here is an example of, how you can actually incorporate this audience and kind of talk about its impact as well. So it's good to have a read of this. And showing this, your knowledge to the examiner really shows them that you have a good authorial intent in understanding both the poets and also understanding how the text is actually constructed. So think deeply about the author's intentions and, what they intended the audience to think thereby. So, yeah. Finally, don't forget that this is poetry. You have to talk about the poetic elements. But here's a mistake most people make. They just throw in techniques randomly without linking them to the poet's message. That's not analysis, that's just name dropping. But what these A+ essays do well is explore how those elements actually augment the author's arguments within the collection. In short, use poetic features to justify each one of your points. It has to have a purpose in your analysis of the text. Let's take a look at an example of where a poetic element is included within an analysis. Here, a structural element is being talked about, and you can see after the structural element is included, there is some sort of an analysis back to the context of the text or whatever issue that is being talked about in relation to the prompt. So you can see here, I'm talking about how there is a form of continuity being established, and as a result, how that shapes the importance of making sense of history through one's own lens, and so on. So you can definitely see that there's a link from the poetic technique back to the main issue that's being discussed. And that is what is being asked from VC students in text response. And this is obviously the best way to separate your essays from good to exceptional, and what separates medium level responses to high-end responses. So always keep that at the back of your mind. Other than that, just make sure you have a good balance of poem quotes from the beginning, middle, end of the collection. And you should have all the tools necessary to get that A+ on your next False Claims of Colonial Thieves essay. All you need to do now is put it all together and get ready to smash your exams. Also, feel free to check out our False Claims of Colonial Thieves exemplar essay up on our website. Also, our quote bank, which is also up on our website. Other than that, thank you for watching and see you later.